The Arizona Cardinals made a significant upgrade to their offensive line by acquiring center Rodney Hudson from the Las Vegas Raiders. But how does the Cardinals line stack up against the rest of the NFC West? Longtime Cardinals fans will tell you that the offensive line has always been a problem. This franchise has rarely had a decent offensive line, let alone a good one. But with the emergence of DJ Humphries, the acquisition of Rodney Hudson, and solid contributions from players like Justin Pugh and Kelvin Beachum, the Cardinals actually have a good offensive line. With that in mind, I thought I would look at the offensive lines from the NFC West and see how they stack up against one another. So to start, let's look at the left tackles in the NFC West. The first thing that I need to point out is that the NFC West has probably the best set of left tackles in the NFL. All four of the starting left tackles for NFC West teams were rated amongst the top 6 in PFF's overall grading for offensive tackles. Trent Williams led the way with a grade of 91.9, followed by DJ Humphries at 88.3, Dwayne Brown at 87.8, and the ageless Andrew Whitworth at 86.8. Williams and Humphries graded better than Whitworth or Brown in terms of run blocking, but in pass blocking, Humphries did grade a little bit lower than his counterparts. When you look at some of the other numbers, you also see a few other areas of strength or weakness among these tackles. Although he graded the highest, Williams also gave up the most sacks with 4. Whitworth only gave up 1, Dwayne Brown 2, and DJ Humphries 3. Dwayne Brown fared a little bit worse in terms of hits allowed, but he fared far worse in terms of hurries and pressures. But when it came to penalties, Trent Williams led the way with 10, followed by Humphries with 7. Each player had their areas of strength or weakness, but altogether, all 4 tackles were outstanding in 2020. But player grades can experience regression from year to year, so in order to compare these players more effectively, I also looked at their grades throughout their career. Here I show you a summary of their grades over the last 5 years. As you can see, each player has had some ups and downs in terms of their grades, but Whitworth, Williams, and Brown have had a better track record than Humphries. I also calculated their average PFF grade over the last 5 years, weighted for snaps, as well as their career average PFF grade, again weighted for number of snaps. And as you can see, Whitworth, Williams, and Brown all have higher career averages and higher averages over the last 5 years. So when you're evaluating Humphries and trying to compare him to this group, it really comes down to this one question. Do you think 2020 was a breakout season and an indicator of where his career is trending moving forward, or do you think it's an outlier? Is he a player whose PFF grades are going to be in the 80s most seasons, or is he going to bounce around between the 60s and 80s? Based on the way tackles sometimes need a few seasons to develop, the fact that he's gone through a few changes in schemes and head coaches over the years, I'm going to give Humphries the benefit of the doubt and assume that this is a sign of things to come, that he's going to be a player that more often than not has PFF grades in the high 70s, if not high 80s. All things considered, I think that Trent Williams is the best left tackle in this division. Andrew Whitworth is probably a close second, with DJ Humphries and Dwayne Brown jockeying for that next position. But regardless of how you rank them, the bottom line is that all 4 of these teams have above average, if not elite, left tackles. Next, we're going to look at NFC West left guards. The division isn't as dominant at this position as it was at left tackle, with only one left guard, Laken Tomlinson, ranking in the top 10 for PFF grades in 2020. In terms of their overall grades, you see Tomlinson leads away with a 78.8. Edwards and Lewis both have grades in the low 70s, but Justin Pugh lags behind with a grade of 64.8. Tomlinson and Lewis were much better in run blocking than were Edwards or Pugh, but Pugh was the best pass blocking left guard in the division. And although Pugh's overall grade was the lowest amongst left guards in the division, he did fare well in some of the other statistics. He had the fewest sacks with 1, the fewest hits allowed with 2, the fewest hurries with 12, the fewest pressures with 15. Now he did have 9 penalties, Rays, which was second behind Damian Lewis. Now, when we look at their grade history, something should jump out to you right away. Edwards and Lewis are both very young players. Lewis was a rookie last year, and Edwards was in his second season. So these are two players who could see some improvements overall moving forward. You'll also notice that Tomlinson had a significantly better grade than he had in any of his previous 4 seasons. Altogether, although Pugh had the worst grade in 2020, his 5-year average actually rates favorably compared to the other guards, and his career average is better than anyone except Damian Lewis, who only has 1 season under his belt. Now, a lot of that has to do with Pugh's time with the Giants, where he graded pretty well in his first couple of seasons. But since joining the Cardinals, he hasn't had a grade over 70. Overall, I do think Tomlinson probably is the best left guard in this division, but it's really tough to differentiate between the next 3. On one hand, Edwards and Lewis did grade better than Pugh last year, but Pugh did fare better in terms of things like hurries and pressures and hits, and he is a veteran who has been around for a while. All 4 of these guards are probably serviceable starters, if not decent starters, but I wouldn't rate any of them as above average. Now we move on to center, a position where the Arizona Cardinals made a significant upgrade by trading for Rodney Hudson. Hudson ranked 8th in overall PFF grade amongst centers, while San Francisco's Alex Mack ranked 16th. The projected starting center for the Rams, Brian Allen, didn't play last year due to COVID, and Ethan Pozick, the center for the Seahawks, ranked 26th overall. Hudson had an overall offensive grade of 73.6, which is one of the lower grades he's had in his career. Now for Brian Allen, the Rams center, I'm using his 2019 numbers because he missed last season due to COVID. In 2019, he rated at 58.6. Alex Mack, the center for the San Francisco 49ers, had one of his worst seasons, grading at 65.9. Throughout his career, he has actually been one of the best centers in the league, and is reuniting this year with Coach Kyle Shanahan, with whom he's had success. So overall, I would actually expect him to have a better grade this next year. Now, starting center Ethan Pozick for the Seahawks has graded pretty poorly throughout his career. In fact, his grade of 59.8 was the best grade of his career thus far. As a point of comparison, he's graded fairly comparably to former Cardinals center Mason Cole. Now, Hudson had the best grades in both run blocking and pass blocking amongst any center in the division. He also tied for the fewest number of sacks, had the fewest number of hits allowed, the fewest number of hurries, allowed the fewest pressures, and had the fewest penalties of any other starting center in this division. Now, when we look at their grades over the last 5 seasons and their 5-year averages and career averages in terms of PFF grades, we see that Rodney Hudson and Alex Mack are clearly the best 2 centers in this division. Over the last 5 years, Hudson has graded in the 70s or 80s every year, though as I noted, last year was one of his lower graded seasons. Brian Allen was drafted in 2018, and he only played 37 snaps his rookie season, so that grade of 80.3 is on a very small sample size. But his 2019 grade of 58.6 is with 563 snaps, so that's more indicative of the kind of player he seems to be. You can also see how Alex Mack's 2020 season was far below what he typically grades at. And as I noted, Ethan Pozick has not been a particularly effective center over his career. Now, in terms of 5-year averages, Alex Mack has a higher grade than Rodney Hudson, but both are pretty comparable. Same goes for their career averages. Mack has the highest career average of the group, followed by Hudson, with Allen and Pozick far behind. Now, in terms of ranking these centers, I think you could make an argument for Hudson or Mack. Based on recent performance, you would probably go with Hudson, but Mack has been overall a higher graded center throughout his career, and many think he's going to have a bounce back year because he's such a great fit for that Kyle Shanahan offense. Either way, there are 2 elite centers in this division, Hudson and Mack, with 2 centers in Allen and Pozick who have a lot yet to prove. Right guard is the position that has the least certainty in terms of who the starters will be. The Arizona Cardinals are expecting to have a competition between Brian Winters, Justin Murray, and perhaps Josh Jones. For the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to use Brian Winters as a starter. But there's not a lot of differentiation between him and Justin Murray, and there's a lot of unknowns about Josh Jones. So unless one of those players really exceeds expectations, I'd say that the right guard position rates about the same for the Cardinals Cardinals regardless of which player actually wins the competition. Austin Corbett is set to be the starter for the Rams, but in San Francisco there could be a competition for that right guard position. ESPN.com currently lists Daniel Brunskill as the starter. Brunskill played a number of games both at center and guard for the 49ers last year, but with the signing of Alex Mack, he's been moved full-time to guard. But the 49ers also drafted guard Aaron Banks in the second round this season, so it's possible he could earn that starting job. And they also have a few other players like Senio Kelemete and Tom Compton that have some starting experience. But for the purposes of this, I'm going with Daniel Brunskill as the starter. The Seahawks acquired guard Gabe Jackson from the Las Vegas Raiders this past offseason in exchange for a 5th-round pick, and they expect him to be the starter in 2021. But overall, when we look at the right guards in the NFC West, it does appear to be the weakest offensive line position in the division. Austin Corbett ranked respectably at 11, but all the other starters ranked pretty low for the position. Now I will note that PFF listed Daniel Brunskill as a center, so that rating of 47 is where his grade of 61.7 would have rated if they had him as a guard. Overall, we see that Austin Corbett had the best grade of any guard at the position at 73.4, with Gabe Jackson and Daniel Brunskill in the low 60s and Winters in the mid-50s. Corbett was the best run-blocking guard by a good bit, with Brunskill coming in second and Jackson and Winters not faring particularly well. Jackson was the best-graded pass-blocking guard of the group, however, with Corbett coming in second and Brunskill and Winters again not faring particularly well. When we look at the other stats, we see that Gabe Jackson and Austin Corbett were the best in terms of not giving up sacks, with Jackson leading the pack in terms of fewest hits, but Brian Winters allowed the fewest hurries. Everyone was fairly comparable in terms of number of pressures, and Winters did have the most penalties with 7. But when you look at Brian Winters' numbers, you have to take one important thing into account. He played half as many snaps as Austin Corbett and far fewer than either of the other two players on this list. So when you take that into account, his numbers of sacks, hits, hurries, pressures, penalties all look far worse by comparison. Now when we look at the last 5 years, the 5-year averages and the career averages, we see that Gabe Jackson does have the best track record so far. Daniel Brunskill's only played a couple of seasons and has graded reasonably well during those years, and Austin Corbett made a pretty big jump this last season. Brian Winters' grades have bounced around a bit, but he seems to be a guy who goes between the 50s and 70s, with most grades probably averaging somewhere in the 60s. And when you look at their 5-year average, everyone in this division at right guard grades somewhere in the 60s, though for their career averages, Gabe Jackson does have a grade at 70.5. All things considered, I would probably still give Gabe Jackson a slight edge over Austin Corbett because he's got a longer track record of performing reasonably well. But if Corbett continues to play well like he did last season, he will likely be the best right guard in this division. Of course, the wild card in all of this is if one of the younger players like Aaron Banks for the 49ers or Josh Jones for the Cardinals steps in, earns that job, and ends up being a really good player. The last position we're going to look at is right tackles. Overall, all 4 teams have at least serviceable starters at the right tackle position. Rob Havenstein of the Rams ranks 14th amongst all tackles, Mike McGlinchey rated 19th, with Brandon Shell of Seattle ranking 38th, and Kelvin Beachum of the Cardinals rating 46th. Havenstein and McGlinchey both had grades right around 80, with Shell and Beachum rating somewhere around 70. Havenstein and McGlinchey were much better in terms of run blocking, while Beachum and Shell were the better pass blockers. Despite having the lowest PFF grade of the group, the Cardinals' Kelvin Beachum actually rated better in most of the other statistical categories. He allowed the fewest sacks, the fewest hits, was second fewest in hurries, second fewest in pressures, and was right in line with everyone else in terms of penalties. This is one of those places where I think the PFF grade isn't telling the whole story with the player. When you look at their grades over the last 5 years and their 5-year average and their career average, Kelvin Beachum actually is very consistent. All of his grades have been, for the most part, in the 60s, most of them in the upper 60s. Havenstein's grades have bounced around a little bit, and in 2019 he had a really poor grade of 50.9. But you also see he's had multiple seasons with grades in the 80s. Mike McGlinchey, who was a first-round pick in 2018, has had grades in the 70s throughout his career and had a career best of 79.6 in 2020. Brandon Shell's grades have bounced around through the 60s with an occasional grade in the 70s. And when you look at their 5-year averages, Havenstein and McGlinchey certainly seem to stand stand out amongst the group. Same goes for their career averages. Overall, I would rate Havenstein and McGlinchey as above average starters, but not elite, with Beecham and Shell rating as average starters. So now that we've gone through each position one at a time, let's see how each offensive line stacks up with one another. Here I show all the starting offensive linemen that I've identified for each of the 4 teams in the NFC West. The players I've highlighted in blue are those who I've identified as high-end players at their positions. This includes all the left tackles and then centers Rodney Hudson and Alex Mack. The players highlighted in green are those who identified as above average starters, which includes both the right tackles for the Rams and the 49ers. All of the players highlighted in yellow are players I consider average starting players at their position, which includes all left guards, 2 of the right guards, and the 2 remaining right tackles. Finally, those highlighted in orange are positions where I think the teams have below average starters, or there's a lot of uncertainty as to who will be the starter. These are generally situations where you would expect the team is looking to upgrade at the position. Now, this could mean that they hope that a young player develops and steps into that position, or that they're going to look to upgrade that position in the next year or so through the draft or free agency. Now, when you take this all into account, I think overall the San Francisco 49ers have the best offensive line in the division. I would then rank the Arizona Cardinals as the second best offensive line based on this analysis, followed by the Rams, and then with the Seattle Seahawks with the lowest rated offensive line. So how would you rank the offensive lines in the NFC West? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're there, please be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel for more Arizona Cardinals content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Cardinal Rule.